Okay, welcome back, Gearheads. Got Fireball and Snackbox coming at you. We're flying solo because that's the way we wanted it this week. We didn't want any of the other riffraff or any of the other opinions. It's just us today. How you feeling, bud? How's it going?
I'm doing well, doing well. Happy to be here.
Awesome. All right, so I've been kicking around this idea, and I was telling Snackbox in the green room just before hitting the record button here that I've been toying around with this idea, and it's more of like not necessarily getting into the philosophy a little bit more behind backpacking, but I have a lot of questions about different viewpoints that other backpackers would have in regards to certain categories and certain questions. And today's question is really around the topic of gear simplicity. So that's one banner that I can throw up right here, and it's really just asking the question: does simplicity really matter, or is it just all solely subjective? I think you're going to find that it is. You're going to find that both of us are probably going to repeat ourselves a lot and say that it's really up to the personal preference of the user for a lot of this stuff. But I think in certain ways and for certain pieces of gear, simplicity can matter. And then with other pieces of gear, I think it matters a little bit less. I think for certain pieces, we're probably going to look at it and go, well, I'm willing to take the extra weight hit or a hit in some other category so that I can have X, Y, or Z piece of gear, piece of kit at camp. So that's the topic today, and that's kind of the ground rule for you there, Snackbox. So let's just roll right into the categories. What do you say? First of which that I have here is going to be to talk about tents. Now, breaking down gear simplicity for tents. What does that mean? So you have sort of like your car camping style tents. You've got the freestanding tents with poles. Those are normally dome type of tents. And then you've got more of the UL, the backpackers, the guys who are worried a little bit more about the weight are probably going to lean more towards either the semi-freestanding or more likely the or what's it called? It's not non-free, non-freestanding, right? Getting caught up on the terminology, but I think they're probably going to stick with more of those styles of tents, and that's going to be more of your typical A-frame, where you got the goofy looking X-mid that's getting really popular nowadays. So what do you think on that, Jared? What do you think on the simplicity of tents? So, again, if you're going with more of the pole structure, you're going with like, a Nemo style tent, Dagger, Hornet, whatever, a little bit more extras, right? You've got extra pockets and stuff for your gear and all that other kind of stuff. And that obviously adds to the weight. But what do you think? Does simplicity matter when it comes to tents, or does it not really matter that much?
It's a great question because it really comes down to, you had mentioned it was subjective, but I think it's subjective in a lot of ways that are not necessarily obvious. So, for example, a lot of it is about experience level, right? So, if you feel really comfortable setting up a non-freestanding tent, then you can often trade off for something that is that's a little bit lighter and simpler. But that said, if you have something where maybe you're newer, or maybe you want something that's more sort of foolproof, you can go with some of those freestanding tents. The Nemos are really great. It's also one of the things that's a factor that doesn't really appear obvious to a lot of folks is that with the advent of better and better materials, the simplicity, the lightness and simplicity connection is becoming disconnected, I guess is the way to say it. So if you're willing to spend more money, you can often get some of those more the freestanding tents now are catching up weight wise with some of the ones that are much more simple. And the trade-off now is really about money. So you're going to be able to find tents and options that are within your price range that are light, etc. One of the things that I have there in the window is sort of the simplest and the most classic setup there. So I've got the little box there if you want to share it. And this is just a solo tarp, right? So this is the bare bones, simplest, and that's pretty inexpensive, right? So we're talking about a tent setup or more of a shelter. It's just a tarp, but it's what they call a catenary tarp, I believe. But it's wider on the ends here than over here, so it sort of tapers. Maybe tapers better than catenary. I don't know if I'm using that word correctly here. But here, if we check out the weight here, we're talking 7 ounces. And so we're dealing with a super, super light setup that's really inexpensive. But obviously here you don't have a floor or a bug net. So that's one of those situations where I could see a lot of times when this would be great if you're dealing with sort of shoulder months in a colder place where the bugs aren't really an issue. Maybe you take a little piece of polycro to sleep on and it could be really nice, but a lot of folks would get ooked out. I know one person here in this conversation would get ooked out at the
Yeah,
potential for
you, right?
bugs. Yeah, right. But anyway, they have a whole range. I mean, it really just runs the gamut there.
Yeah, and I mean, you're even going even more simple than the example that I pulled up, where you're just like straight up tarp and almost cowboy style camp. I mean, I think the tarp is really probably either that or maybe like a bivy or a bug net is kind of like the most minimal that you can go within the category of actually being called a shelter. Um, and potentially not protecting you from the elements, like you just mentioned, with either bugs or splatter or like rain and stuff like that. So, but yeah, that's a great point too. I always look at it from three different pillars as far as like my own personal, when I'm choosing gear and when I want to buy gear, I'm always looking at three different categories. It's comfort, it's price, and it's weight. But for me, I always lean a little bit more towards comfort. Hence the fact that I always like to carry like a bug net, and I don't want to be thinking about stuff crawling on my face at night. But yeah, as far as like, what do you think about like overall comfort and stuff like that? I think like comfort when it comes to like if you're going with either a non-freestanding or a freestanding tent, I'm not sure that going more simple means that you're sacrificing a lot of comfort when it comes to tents. With one of these other categories that we're going to get into another topic with another piece of gear, I think it's a little bit more of a concern or a little bit more of a talking point. But I wouldn't say that if you go more simple on your tent or more slim down that it's necessarily going to be less comfortable. I'm not sure about like hammocks. I haven't really done a lot of hammock camping. I think it's probably a little bit more pertinent there, especially if you're saving money and you're going with an Eno style of hammock versus like a dream hammock or something like that. But what do you think on that?
Yeah, I think the comfort there, the place where I would say comfort really gets where the competition really is are you going to be more comfortable in camp or on the trail? And so if you go
True.
with a freestanding tent, you're going to be more comfortable in camp, right? So you'll be able to set your tent up in a lot more places. Freestanding tent also, because of the more complicated sort of structure of the pole system, you can actually sort of shake it out and get all the dirt out really easily. But then when you put it in your backpack, it tends to be either larger or heavier, often both. Whereas with a
Yep.
tent that's, say, a trekking pole tent, it's simpler in design, but you're more limited on where you can put it. It's also more difficult to set it up because you have to make sure that it's put somewhere that you can actually stake it in firmly. And it just is, it's often also single wall for those simpler designs rather than a double wall tent. So you will have condensation issues that you have to deal with. Oh, there's a fly, huh? Speaking of bugs, right? Um, so I
Case in
probably shouldn't have
point.
freaked out about a housefly like that if I was going to tell you to take a tarp here. But
Yep.
yeah, it's basically, in my mind, a lot of it comes down to where do you want to exercise your comfort while you're hiking or while you're at camp. For me personally, I tend to say that I'd rather be comfortable on the trail because I tend to spend a lot more time awake on the trail than I do sitting around camp.
That's true. Yeah, that's an excellent point. You definitely have to see what you're built more for. I think I'm definitely leaning a little bit more towards the camp life and being comfortable at camp, whereas Jared likes to crush miles when he's out on trail. All right, I think that's a pretty good roundup when it comes to tents. I mean to round that out, I would say not necessarily. If you're going with a fully enclosed shelter, right? I don't think that going with the full blown car camping option, the half dome or the day, make that much of a difference when it comes to comfort. The only thing in regards to comfort is really just the amount of interior space, right? So a lot of the dome style tents make it feel like you've got more interior space, and you do. I mean, I think just from like cubic inches or whatever, and when you're trying to sit up, or if you're in a 2P and you've got two wide pads, can you fit those on the bottom? Does it have like that 50 inches of space or not? I mean, I think all of those can factor in, but there's a lot of different factors that you got to look at. Are you going to be out there solo? How long are you going to be out there? And all that stuff kind of comes into play. But In my own personal opinion, I'd probably say like simple, especially if you're carrying the weight on your back, is probably a little bit better. I'm always going to lean more towards like shedding as much weight as possible while still getting a couple of those creature feature comforts in there if I can sneak them in. But I'm going to lean towards like shedding the weight over having a million different pockets in my tent, or a canopy or something like that.
Yeah, and actually, before we move on past the tents here, I want to just kind of make one last point about one of the advantages with some of the more complex tents. And so here, this is one of the, I mean, it's one of the tents you just mentioned there is the REI Half Dome tent. And so what I want you to notice is actually not the X bar. So it's got this sort of X setup system with two poles that cross, but there's also a third small pole that pulls these two corners out to the side. And what that means there is
Yep.
it's not just the space that you're sitting in, it's also your head space there, which is 100% overlooked because often when you look at the tent specs, they will describe the footprint specs, how much space it covers. But if you're talking about a pyramid tent, some of that space is not actually usable. And so this tent has that sort of ingenious design to pull things out. The trade-off, of course, is that you're dealing with here a tent that's almost, I think the current version is 4.5 pounds. Whereas I have some pyramid tents that are 4-person that are 2 pounds, right? And so you're dealing with a very different kind of setup. But it is important as you're thinking about what tent will work to think a little bit about that usable space. The other thing that I would say is for a 2-person tent, I don't think I'll ever go back to a 2-person tent that has one door. So these two doors are really important, and specifically two doors on the long
Yep.
side are really helpful so that you're not climbing over your pillow when you're getting in and out of the tent at night. It's just so much better. It just really is. This is one of those sort of genius inventions or um, innovations, rather.
So are you saying that you're done with the Gossamer Gear the One? Is that what you're saying? Because it only has one door?
Well, it's only for one person as well, but a 2-person tent, you
Right.
want the two doors so that you can both
Oh,
get in and out
definitely.
without disturbing each other. Yep.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
All right. I think that's a pretty good roundup of the tents. So, and I'm apologies. I'm just trying to like get all of my screen sharing in on it as well. Let's slide on over into the next category here, and we're going to be talking about backpacks. So these are two of the biggest pieces of gear that we're going to be talking about tonight. The other two are a little bit smaller. One's actually more of a luxury item, but I wanted to cover backpacks next. So let me see if I can share my screen now. And let's select this guy here. Here we go. There's the tried and true and the favorite here. This is an example of your simple style, right? So you've got the Hyperlight Southwest 40, and they also have the Junction. So again, what are we looking at here? It's literally, and a lot of backpacks are following this same style, Z packs and whatnot. It's literally just a tube, right? It's just one central pocket. And then you've got some outside pockets, usually a roll top design where it just rolls down, and that's pretty much it, right? There's not a lot that's extra there. This one actually has a frame, if you want to call it a frame. It's really just an aluminum stay. Z-Packs uses carbon fiber stays, but they don't really do a great job at load lifting, shifting that load from your shoulders down to your hips. So not a really great option as far as more of your minimalist design. If you're going to go that minimal, then I would definitely recommend just non-frame pack and letting your back sweat. But I wanted to share my screen yet again here and kind of show the opposite side of that spectrum, which is going to be something like this. This is your Gregory Baltoro. Won a bunch of different awards, apparently, I think, at one point in time. And this is more of like your starter pack and what people think of there, right? For when you're just starting to get into backpacking, a lot of people just kind of assume like, oh, let me just get this huge frame in on it. Let me get the thick shoulder straps and the top brain compartment and all the different bells and whistles. And something like this is probably going to be more comfortable, but that weight penalty is anywhere from double, 3 times, 4 times the weight if you're talking about like a mystery ranch pack, something like that. And it's just a tank, it's an anvil. But at the same time too, is is it going to be a more that it will. Does it have a dedicated frame in it that can accurately shift that weight from your shoulders down to your hip the way that it should? I definitely think that it could. And the overall comfort of that is what you're going to be looking for that weight penalty. But what do you think on packs there, Snackbox?
Yeah, I think this is one of those places where I typically go with a simpler design. I tend to think simplicity is much better. I don't know that that's the case here, and I think that often the sort of weight penalty that you mentioned, which is basically you're paying more for something more comfortable, I I think you can often, if not always, make the argument that the weight penalty is worth it, especially for the wear on your body and the sort of exhaustion and fatigue, right? So that
Yep.
Baltoro bag that you showed, you're talking about a bag. I think that one might be about 3 pounds compared to the other bag that's 1.5 pounds, 1 pound, something. But you're only taking a pound and a half more, 2 pounds more to have a lot more comfortable bag that's going to be able to really distribute that weight much more effectively. And if you're talking about a big hike, that's super important. Now,
Yep.
I do think that the interesting piece is really about the materials again, right? That Baltoro bag was really popular back when I was in grad school. My buddy had one. It was incredible. It was the most comfortable bag I've ever put on at that time, and I think maybe even still, because the materials they used were so good. But then you have the sort of development of bags using that DCF, the DCF, or even now we've got the Eco Pack material. And that stuff is all really nice, but it still hasn't really caught up with the way to make them as comfortable or distribute the weight as evenly because they have to sacrifice that frame structure. What I typically think is find one that works, shoot for under 3 pounds or around 3 pounds, and get the most comfortable bag you can, and that you can afford as well. So don't confuse cost in this case with a good bag. So that Baltoro bag was $329, and the other bag is, that one was $349, right? And so you can easily get into some really expensive bags that way. But it's one of those where really it's all about your preference and can you really pare down your pack and your rig enough to make a frameless bag work. That often means you're going to need to spend a lot more money on the rest of your gear and be a lot more prepared to deal without.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people look at it as kind of a progression, like you had just mentioned. Like, when you get to a point where you're dialing your gear enough where you can kind of shed that weight and you can finally think about going frameless. That also means that you know how to pack your pack, right? You know how to distribute that weight. You know how that weight feels on your shoulders after X number of miles, and that's something that I guess is a little bit more expert level if you're talking about hitting the trail with a frameless pack. But again, the trade off is you're gonna have your back is gonna be drenched. It's gonna be like super sweaty, and there's gonna be zero ventilation. I'm gonna play devil's advocate a little bit on you there because you had mentioned like having a super comfortable pack that can deal with that load balancing and that extra weight. I'm pushing more for, getting that weight down if you can. But like you said, it's definitely going to cost you a little bit more to do that. But again, is offsetting the extra weight of the pack and making your pack lighter actually going to make you more comfortable on trail, or is that frame pack with the cushy shoulder straps and everything going to be your preferred pack? It's really, again, up to you. It's up to you as the user to make that distinction and go like, oh yeah, this Baltoro pack is an extra pound or pound and a half over this frameless pack, but it's so comfortable. I love the way that it rides and the way that it fits me, so it's definitely worth the wait for me. Something like that, right?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. The only thing that I might adjust a little bit is it's not necessarily use the phrase like expert level, right? Figuring that out. And I would say that it's actually I it's sort of splitting hairs here, but I would say it's more just experience level, right? And
True.
so experience meaning that you're comfortable with certain things that maybe you weren't initially. So, I think what happens, or the sort of trajectory that I've experienced and I've seen other people, is you start out with inexpensive gear because you're not sure if you're going to like the hobby, which tends to be heavy and bulky and big. And then you get out there and you have a good time and you realize that it's worth it. So then you start upgrading certain items, right? Most people start with a synthetic bag and then switch over to down. That's pretty early. Then you get a better tent.
Yep.
backpacks follow, stoves, etc. You become a sort of a gearhead, and you start paring down everything. So then eventually you're out there using this like ultralight sleeping pad that sounds like potato chips, and you're using a down sleeping bag that's nice but kind of probably a little too cold, and a tent that has a lot of the features that you or doesn't have a lot of the features that you wish you did have from the previous. So you kind of get down to this like bare minimum, and then you start adding stuff. So for me, that happened when I was, I was using a floorless tent for a while with Tyvek, and then I was like, this kind of, the Tyvek is just taking up so much space here because I couldn't figure out how to get it to pare down. So then I ended up starting to add stuff, right? So I started getting back, adding a couple ounces here and there because I realized that was what I wanted. But there's no expertise in that. It's just experience and spending the time out, getting comfortable with things, knowing what you can do without and still have a good night's sleep, which I think is ultimately what we're talking about here. And then figuring out where you're now ready to add some ounces because it's worth 7 ounces to have a floor on your tent, or it's worth 2 pounds to have a frame system that adjusts the weight better, or maybe it's not worth that. Maybe it's worth carrying a bag that's lighter and spending more time adjusting your pack and how it fits and everything fits in the pack, so you're not carrying that weight. But it's really just about experience and knowing yourself and knowing your body and experience out there. I kind of expertise, but a very specific to you expertise.
Yeah, definitely experience goes a long way. And you gave me a great idea for another show here, which is gear progression. So we're definitely going to have you back for that one as well. But you're right. You see a lot of those trends where you start off in a certain direction and then you try to go extreme in the other direction. And then you just like, well, what can I add back? Because I know that I got it dialed in, but I want some of these other extras in there as well. So that's a really cool topic that we can go off on a whole tangent about as well. Anything else? Did you want to share your screen here for this one, or?
Yeah. So I'll show this one here. This is actually it's a good example of a really complicated frame. It's the Osprey frame, and so this is the one that is the most complicated frame, but it's one of the ones that I think people swear by if you're going to go with an internal frame pack. And I don't know if you can really see it a whole lot here, but it pushes the bag. There's this mesh netting and maybe an inch or two separating your back from the pad because there are these bars that run kind of here. So it's kind of a butterfly shaped frame system that runs in here. And it pushes the bag off of your back. And these are kind of the textbook, if you're going to buy an internal frame pack that's complicated, one of the reasons you would is actually to get that pack away from your back to get the ventilation, which is interesting because it's one of the things that you don't think of when you're buying a backpack is how sweaty your back's going to be. And some people, it's like nails on a chalkboard having a sweaty back, and other people just don't care. But if you care, you care a lot. There's nobody who's like, well, it's kind of uncomfortable. It's either like, this is the worst thing that I could ever experience, or I don't care at all. But that's a really good example of that. And this is kind of a middle ground, I guess. It's less expensive than the Baltoro Osprey packs are, but they're more expensive than, say, a Six Moon Designs. Now, in terms of that gear progression too, that I think is interesting is as you learn what you like and don't like, I think maybe this is for that episode, but I think for most people, there comes a point when you start out, you get excited, you go to REI, and you're so amped about all this gear and all the features and such, and then you figure out what features don't work, and you start paring down. Then eventually, you go into REI and realize there's not really much there you want anymore. That most of the stuff that you want, you're buying from cottage makers or other gear makers that don't sell in REI, which is a really interesting kind of moment when you realize that you're there and they don't have a lot of the gear that you want in your pack, right?
Yeah.
But that's probably for another show.
Yeah, that's definitely for that other show. But yeah, just to speak on the I think they call it the anti-gravity system. It's definitely one of the best for Osprey here for sure. I've also heard some negative, feedback around that clamshell where they have the hip belt there too. That is kind of like more of a vice grip on certain models and actually digs into you a little bit more. So give and take there, but they're definitely one of the more popular names, especially since they have a crazy guarantee on their products too, that you can send back if it
Yep.
ever fails you like 10, 20 years down the road or whatever. So that's pretty awesome too.
Yeah,
All
it's
right.
pretty. EMS used to make the sort of regional competitor with REI used to make bags with a similar kind of system. Um, and it's unfortunate. I used to buy them on clearance all the time, which is probably why they're not making them anymore. But they had a similar sort of system, and I got two bags that are similar, like knockoff Osprey bags that were great for a long time, and they were like 45, $60 brand new, something like that. It was great,
Yeah, that's
but they
awesome.
don't sell them anymore.
Okay. All right. I think that's a pretty good roundup of the packs here. Let's get into the third of the fourth piece of gear that I want to talk about. And the next one up here on the ticket is going to be your cook kits, your mess kits. Do you even need one of those kind of kits? And again, this could be speaking more towards the gear progression again, but let me break down this one real quick. So let's start with the simple side of things, right? You've got your simple backpacking meals, something like a Tokes, whatever milliliter, 550 up to 1,000 or whatever. And then maybe an Isopro can. You got your BRS stove. And that's pretty much as lightweight as you can go and as simple as you can go, aside from, one of my favorites, which is alcohol stove system. But that's a different topic. And then on the other end of things, you've got people who care a little bit more about eating maybe more delicious foods on trail rather than something that's freeze dried and you just need some hot water in a bag. So those are the people who are going to bring more of your pans, more utensils, spatulas, chopping blocks, and cutting boards and things like that, knives and whatever. Definitely more to it. But they definitely care a little bit more about what they're bringing on trail. Snack box, if you have yours up, I can kick it over to you before
Sure.
I kind of show my version. But what do you think on simplicity with cook kits? Is it worth it to carry the extra weight so that you can have something that is a little bit more tasty on trail and or at camp? Or is just a Tokes and a BRS good enough?
Well, kind of both, right? Like a Tokes and a BRS is typically good enough, and a BRS is just they call it the Hornet, I think, is the stove, or the BRS 3000. It's like a
3,000.
yeah, $15 number off of Amazon. I think Dave will probably put a link below for you all to check it out. And it's really simple. It's just you put this sort of Bunsen burner on a can of Isopro, and then you've got a titanium pot and boil water, and that's pretty well the only thing you'd need. Now, what I will say is that by way of the food you're putting in or preparing, right? That really, to me, comes down to how long you're going to be in the woods, right? So if you're going on a 4 or 5 day trip, you don't want anything more than the most you want to have to do is boil water, and that's it. Now, if you're going on an overnight, or especially if you're trying to take somebody out for the first time backpacking, I encourage you to take like a setup, right? Like go out there, take a skillet, pack some eggs in, and get some hash browns, get something going, some onions. What I will say is also you can probably do a lot of the cutting and stuff back at home and take it in a baggie. That's a lot better
That's
than
true.
trying to cut it out in the woods. Now, what I will say too is, unless you really need a complicated setup, don't overthink it, right? So a jet boil is a great option because it's so simple. So a jet boil is sort of the pot and stove kind of integrated in one. That's great for somebody because it's going to carry you from beginner to as advanced as you want to be. It's plenty for anybody. But then they have some competitors here, and I've got this one here. I think Dave will pull it up for us, which is probably one of the more complicated and expensive rigs you can get, which is this wind burner stove. And if you need this, you know you need it. And so if you don't know that you need a stove like this because you're doing some serious, like you're climbing Denali, right, or Everest or something, if you don't know you need this stove, you don't need this stove. So keeping it simple and inexpensive is really important. I think that's also key. It's also important with all of these to know you can get into backpacking inexpensively, right? That's something I firmly believe in. So don't go with the most expensive thing, confusing that with quality, because this is really a super specific need. And if you spent half that, you can get a jet boil, ostensibly the same thing. Now, what I will say as well is you brought up alcohol stoves. And just to kind of give you a picture of what that is something like this. So this is the size of a 9-volt battery. There's some carbon felt in here, and you soak it with a little bit of alcohol and light it up, and it'll burn until the alcohol is gone. So you get a little sort of piece of mesh and circle this and put your pot up on it. These are typically a good option for a lot of folks if you're doing certain types of backpacking. It's become less a good option now that you have the, that BRS stove, because they're so inexpensive and light anyway. But basically, this is what we have. Or you can also do the Talenti jar with cold soaking. But again, getting into that progression, right? My experience with cold soaking or doing stoveless, which is basically taking food you don't have to cook into the backcountry, peanut butter, tortillas, etc., is that you don't actually save that much weight. And the reason is that when you take a stove, you can take dehydrated foods, whereas when you go stoveless, you have to take food that has most of its moisture still retained. So tortillas, even though it's a small amount of moisture, has it. Cheeses, salamis, etc., raisins, whatever. So I think in terms of, is it worth it? My personal opinion, and it's just my personal opinion, is that stoveless probably isn't worth it, right? Cold soaking might be. Cold soaking, I think, could be. You could make a pretty good argument for that, but I don't think stoveless is really. My experience was that was just as heavy as and bulky as carrying a stove. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, you could also take that a step further and say, like, if you're worried about the overall cost of fuel and maybe you want to save a little bit extra there, maybe you can do that. Or if you're on a trip and maybe it's very difficult to find fuel at your destination because you can't fly with it, maybe that's something else that you might want to consider. Or maybe you just want to do it for a stretch, right? Like if you're going, on a longer trail and you just want to do without the stove for a little bit, maybe you can do that as well. But you heard it here first, folks. Snackbox is done with cold soaking forever. He was a proponent of it for a while, and now he's just completely done with it. So glad to break that news.
That's a 100% fair representation of what I just said right there.
I didn't look into that at all, right?
Yeah, I mean, just to highlight one of the things you said there too, Dave, is give it a shot, right? So especially if you're going on a weekend, if you're interested in trying stoveless, go for it. If you're interested in cold soaking, go for it. If you're interested in an elaborate setup, try it. I mean, that's the whole thing that makes this fun, because I mean, and you and I are great examples of this, right? When we go backpacking, my setup is completely different than yours, and it works, right? So you've got certain things where you're fine with an alcohol stove. I think that's silly, right? I think you can find, I mean, if you can't find fuel somewhere, that means you're going in the backcountry too far, right? But all the same, but then you also have things like, I'm comfortable with certain tents that you're not, or I'm comfortable with leaving certain things behind. Where you take a chair, I'm taking a butt pad, right? But there's no harm in trying out something new and seeing if it works, and then really checking, is this worth what I'm carrying or is it not? It's one of the best things, because then you get out in the backcountry and when we went to the Smokies, we had 8 different people with 8 different setups, and 8 different people had what worked for them. And that's, kind of the joy of it, right?
Yeah, it's pretty awesome, especially when you're like info sharing too, and like, oh, what do you got and how do you like it? And it's always a fun topic as well. All right, I'm gonna throw in one more here. Let me share my screen again real quick and show you an example of one from MSR. And MSR, and I would say maybe Sea to Summit are kind of the kings of this here. But here's an example of a more intricate design, right? And I think maybe Snackbox and I are kind of on the same page here, where it's sort of like, you don't necessarily have to get fooled, particularly with backpacking, that you need something like this. This is definitely a lot more intricate, and probably a lot more than most people need. I mean, here you're looking at something that is a system, right? And here you can see it's almost $90, right? Which is crazy expensive in my opinion. But you've got a bowl, you've got some cups, you've got your pot, maybe another bowl here with the lid, and it's a good example of kind of like excess, right? In excess here, where you don't necessarily need these things. Maybe it fits a little bit better for car camping rather than backpacking. Do you need a dedicated secondary cup for your hot coffee in the morning, or can you just sip it right out of the pot? Right. I mean, these are all different questions that you kind of have to ask yourself, and figure out what you want to deal with there. But I don't necessarily, and I wouldn't really recommend something like this. Just a little bit too intricate for the trail, right? I would definitely save something like these are great options, and again, because of how they nest in together and how it all comes together, I think it's an amazing option for car camping because it's actually pretty compact if you're looking at it from like a car camping perspective. But for the trail, I just don't think that it's 100% necessary.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I also think there's something nice about if you have two people having a setup like that, and there's some other uses
It's
that you'll
true.
start discovering. So, the lid to the one there could be used as a cutting board if you're cutting up some stuff. Also share,
Yeah.
one of the names you left out there is GSI, which is my personal favorite for cook sets. And this is a great example of a place where there's a really good middle ground, right? So this is the GSI Soloist. So if you're a person looking
Yep.
to go solo backpacking, this is 100% my favorite setup. So I always throw away the spork because I find it to not be all that useful. But I love the pot setup is really great. This has got the little cup with the neoprene, so you can make your coffee with the hot water. Leave a little bit of hot water in there, and then you're going to put in your oatmeal, that kind of thing. It also has a really nice strainer. It's just really nicely made. And then it's made small enough that here you can fit your stove and everything with the canister of fuel in it. I love this
Yeah.
setup. It's $60. It's a great deal. Now, what I did try is their minimalist version, which is literally called the minimalist here. And so this is basically what it is. It's a smaller stove. It's got the spork that you still throw away. It's got a smaller pot and a lid that kind of gets stuck with it. And then here you've got the little pot holder, so you don't have a little arm on it. You don't actually save that much weight, and it's a lot less stable. And that
Hmm.
lid there, when you're trying to cook something, if you don't know to turn it over, turn it upside down, it becomes dangerous, right? When you're boiling
Yeah.
water, because then you can't actually remove it from the stove. This is one for $34. You're going to save like an ounce or so. It's silly. It's just silly. Get the one with the handle here because then you can actually pour stuff out. It's safer. You're not saving all that much weight. I love this setup, and I could not dislike my minimalist more. So it's a great example of a place where I typically go more minimal, the better. This is not a place where I find that to be useful, specifically because you're not actually gaining that much, but you're sacrificing a whole lot.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect example of how the tech, right, and the gear innovation really makes a difference here to kind of like bridge that gap. Like you said, that lid. I mean, and I think I don't. I think it's Devin from Backcountry Exposure. He's used that cup for like the last like almost decade or something, right? It's because he just finds it so useful, and it's got the measurements on the side and everything too. So, yeah, you're right. Like having that ability to like flip it over, snap it closed, and be an insulated cup is pretty innovative. It's something that I haven't really seen too many. So, I
Yeah, and
mean, they're selling points for sure.
GSI is great because they're very thoughtfully made. It's clear backpackers were part of the development of those different items. And their two-person setup, the dualist, right, is great because the cups actually nest inside bowls. So you get, for two people, you'd have two cups with neoprene sleeves, two bowls that slide in, packs in really nicely. And if you can use the lids as cutting boards. It's a smart made setup with a couple of things that I don't love, right? Like I don't care for the spork. I just, it's not something that I need. But it's so thoughtfully made. It's got the measurements on the side. It's just really good. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's awesome. All right. I think that's a good roundup of that one. Let's slide into the last one here. And we are going to be talking about a little bit more of a luxury item. And we're going to be talking about gear simplicity when it comes to chairs. Does it matter when it comes to bringing a backpacking chair? I think you're going to find that it's becoming more and more of a commonplace that people decide to bring a chair unless they're doing a bunch of miles, like Snackbox is going to be doing pretty soon. I'm definitely going to highlight you there at the end of the stream on that one. But people just want that comfort, right? They want some level of that comfort, even if it's not a full-blown chair with a back. It's a stool or something like that. Like Huck, who's a regular on our show too, is a big fan of the Grand Trunk stool now, which is gaining in popularity. But does simplicity with chairs matter? And I'm going to take the first slot here. Let me share my screen again real quick. All right, so for more of the simple side of things, before I share my screen, you're going to be thinking about, all right, what's my 1 pound chair option if I want that back support, right? You've got the REI FlexLight Air chair, which is what I bring. You've got the Helinox Chair Zero. Those have become like the staples, right? It's 1 pound, super ultra light if you're talking about a chair, but yet can still hold up to 250, 265 pounds, right? Packs down really small, and is a great option. And then you've got something like this. Let me share my screen here, which is more of your intricate option. And we're looking at the Nemo Moonlight Reclining Camp Chair. So this one is closer to 2 pounds, 1 pound and 14 ounces. And literally, like, the only things that are different about this chair is that the thickness of the aluminum that they're probably using here is probably a little bit more beefy, so it feels a little bit more solid when you're sitting in it. And then you can notice here that they have these 2 buckles on either side, so it enables you to be in more of that reclining mode, right? Or have the option to sit a little bit more upright and erect, right? It's another great option, but again, it costs right around the same, if not more. 160, I think, is even more than both of the ultralight options that I was mentioning at the normal MSRP. And again, is it worth it? I mean, that's really up to you. Again, I kind of see this as even more luxury, even more of that weight hit going for this Nemo option here, but it can hold a little bit more weight here as well. But at 1 pound and 14 ounces for more than the cost of the FlexLight Air or the Helinox Chair Zero, I think is a little bit excessive. But what do you think on simplicity with chairs, Snackbox? I know you're not a huge fan of it, but what do you think on that? Oh, the co-host ducked out for a little bit. I'm having a little bit of internet issues there, but yeah, I was basically saying, Snackbox there. What do you think on the simplicity when it comes to your chair? I know you're not a huge fan. You don't always bring one, but does it matter? Like, do you need those extra features? Do you need something that's a little bit more beefy and sure on its feet, or can you get away with more of the flimsy ultralight option?
Yeah, I think this one really comes down to sort of wallet, and a lot of it kind of is age too. My experience, when you get a little older, it's worth the extra, would you call it, a weight penalty to have a seat so that you can kind of keep your knees intact. There are a couple of other options that I think are worth showing. So the first is for what I take on sort of longer through hikes. It's just a closed cell foam pad. They're nice to have just to keep your like, if it's been raining, you don't have to sit down on wet ground. I also find these really useful when paired with a bear canister for sort of lumbar support. But then there's this other middle ground area. These are sort of the classic. They're called Crazy Creeks. So you kind of sit in here and you sit on the ground for sure, but they're nice because they roll up. They're less expensive often than some of those other chairs. But these were kind of classic old school, but they're kind of going the way of the dodo, where now the other chairs have gotten so advanced that and light that you can take a really small, like a smaller chair that gets your feet up off the ground or your butt up off the ground. But these are also a really good one if you are, say you're going to go sit in some shelters, right? So you're going to hike maybe Raccoon Creek State Park in Pennsylvania, or Laurel Mountain Trail or something, Laurel Highlands Trail, whatever that one is. There are a couple in Pennsylvania that are really famous for having these really terrific shelters. These are great shelter chairs, right? The AT, I don't know, a lot of people probably don't really sit around in the shelters as much there, but these are good options, and they're nice because they're adjustable.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think your brother Champ had this when we were out in the Smokies, right? I think he had a version of this, and he was kind of like using it off of a log, and that seemed like the most optimal use for it, because you're not directly on the ground, but you still have that back support. Do you know, like, on average what the weight of this is here? Because I know you said that they're kind of going by the wayside because of the tech, but
Yeah, the volume seems to be more the issue with that. They're about 1.5 pounds. It
Yeah.
looks like this one is 1 pound,
Ooh.
4 ounces.
Yeah.
And they're big. I mean, they're bigger, probably about the same volume as the camp chairs, the ultralight camp chairs that you take. I will say that when I've taken a camp chair, I've always enjoyed it. But it's often just doesn't make the cut for a backpacking trip, the longer ones, because it's just too big volume wise, and I'm trying to pare
Yeah.
everything down. But I never judge somebody having a chair out in a campsite because it's always comfortable and so nice at the end of a long trip or a long day hiking.
Yeah. That's awesome. What do you normally grab if you are bringing a chair? What do you usually grab?
Whatever Patty's got. um, Patty's got some really great, nice chairs. I have taken Crazy Creeks before. She's got, I think, the Helinox sounds familiar.
Okay.
And they're not terribly. I mean, again, the technology and the materials are getting so good. You can get some of them. I mean, what's the Helinox set you back now? I mean, they're not much different than the $65. Um,
I think they're around like they used to be 120. I think they're up to either 130 or 140.
yeah,
Now they've gone up. And then you can also, I mean, REI has their knockoff version. That's the one I got, and I saw it on sale. I mean, it's normally about $100, and I think I've seen it as low as half of that. I've seen it like $50 on like their July 4th sale or something like that. So I was almost, there's the newfies. I was almost gonna pick up the just another chair because it was like so ridiculously cheap, and I was like, it might as well. I mean, if even if it breaks, like, why the hell not? You know what I mean? Like, that's I think as cheap as it gets for a 1 pound chair.
yeah, and that's one of the other things is if they're any of these products, I I firmly believe you should never pay full price for any backpacking gear because there's always a
True.
sale. There's always an email list you can sign up for 10 to 20% off a new product. Just knowing, kind of having a running list of things you'd like to have and then waiting for it to go on sale or waiting for that 20% off. I think REI does one in March with the dividend, and then they give another one out in September for Labor Day. Labor Day, Memorial Day, Labor Day. But they give
Yeah, I think
out
it's Labor Day.
basically you have two options typically to get 20% off. I love Backcountry. Backcountry.com does really good stuff, typically free advertising, I guess. Moose Jaw is fun. They have just so many of these vendors that will give you 20% off for just giving them your email, and
Yeah.
you can unsubscribe right away and still get the 20% off.
Yeah, that's great. I'm gonna share again real quick. Maybe this is gonna end up kind of splitting the gap between both of them. Although I haven't really seen, I don't think I've ever seen one on trail. I've seen a couple of channels highlighted here and there, but this is kind of like a cross between the one that you were talking about and a chair. So new tech, but it's using your sleeping pad. This is Sea to Summit's Air Chairs. So you're basically just configuring your blown up pad with this option. The only problem that I saw with something like this, if you go to the tech specs here, if you have a larger mat, it's still going to set you back about 10 ounces. So you are saving a few ounces there, but give and take, right? You might end up risking, popping your pad. I mean, I'm sure that it's a thicker material on this thing here, but you're getting, again, still closer to the ground, but you're still able to save a little bit, I guess, with this option. But definitely, it's probably going to take you a little bit to put this thing together.
Yeah, one of the things that's sort of if we're talking simplicity versus complexity, right? Um,
Yeah.
for any people who are interested in seeing some really adventurous or daring manufacturers, follow Sea to Summit and follow Sierra Designs, right? Those are the two companies that are always willing to take a shot in the dark, kind of try something new that's probably going to blow up in their face, but it's still going to be really innovative. They both come up with some of the coolest, weirdest designs for things. Like they had the Sierra Designs backcountry bed, which was sort of a middle ground between a sleeping bag and a quilt. Or, without Sierra Designs, we don't have carbon fiber tents with the UFO Mojo. That was an $1,800 freestanding DCF tent. It's crazy. I mean, look it up. DCF, the UFO Mojo was insanity, but without them, we don't have all the rest of these, but follow both of those companies because they do a great job of testing out some stuff. And I imagine that's probably what's going on with that chair is they don't really think it's going to catch on, but they're just kind of trying something, right? And seeing what's out there and what people have interest in. But Sea to Summit does some wild stuff, and it's fun to watch.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. I mean, if you had to ask me, like, you can only choose one company to outfit your entire kit for you, like, what would you choose? I probably would lean more towards Sea to Summit just because of the amount of products that they have. It's just
Yeah.
insane. Like, they literally are like a one-stop shop. You can get a pack, you can get a tent, you can get, everything for your cook kit and everything from them. So
Yeah,
yeah,
my
definitely a
favorite
great
sleeping
point.
bag ever was a Sea to Summit, and they had this thing. It was a Sea to Summit Trek 2, I think it was, and I ended up giving it to my brother. But it had a thing where it had sort of a stiff piece of plastic, kind of, it's hard to describe, but it was ran along parallel the zipper, so you'd never snag the sleeping bag in the zipper. It was incredible. But that's one of the things that, without a company like Sea to Summit willing to try some stuff that's, like weird and you're like, I don't know, we don't get these cool innovations, right? So that's one of the things I do appreciate. They're from New Zealand, so don't hold that against them. If you've ever worked in food service, you know that New Zealanders never tip a penny, which is just, I mean, it's insane. Can I say this for a second here? I know this is not backpacking related, but I worked in food service and people from New Zealand would never tip a penny ever. And when
Wow.
I was sitting at a bar once and somebody from New Zealand kept stiffing my buddy who was the bartender. And I said, we tip here. And he said, well, we're not used to that in New Zealand. And I was like, well, you're also not used to driving on the right side of the road, but you seem to have adjusted well to that. Don't come over here and pretend that our social mores aren't to be followed because you're just
Right.
out of your element. But anyway, Sea to Summit is good company. Come on, New Zealand, be better.
Yeah. Yeah, come on, New Zealand. I love that tangent. That's awesome. All right, those are all the bullet points that I have for today. Jared, if you have anything else that you want to throw in here for the closing arguments or any other pieces that you want to discuss, feel free. Otherwise, we can wrap this one up.
No, I mean, I think that's it. I think really the only thing that I really like to reiterate as much as possible is to figure out what works well for you. Don't let cost stand in the way. Like there are inexpensive options that are light, they're light options. There are also more complicated options that are more stable for certain tents or sleeping bags or whatever you're dealing with. You can find an option that's affordable that will work for you. So don't ever confuse the price tag with quality because it's often that's not what's determining where the price point is.
Yeah, and I like your analogy that you've used, before in the past, where you're saying, like, if you can get away with something that is in the ballpark of something that is 2 or 3 times the price, well, you can use that money on a plane ticket to go somewhere else. So I really enjoy that. Yeah, I would agree. It really, again, is going to come down to you and what you want. Definitely use, like, the garage sales, and you can always resell gear too. That's another option. Just try to figure it out yourself, but just get out there. Like, figure out a reason to get out there with whatever you got, especially when you're first trying it out, right, and seeing if you like it or not. I agree with you as well that, bring the eggs, bring the steaks when you first get out there. Try to make it as comfortable as you can to enjoy it. Because the flip side of that is going out with some really crappy meals and having a horrible night's sleep and going like, this really isn't for me, which,
Right.
we are obviously against on this show. We're encouraging you getting out there and enjoying your time out there rather than having a bad time out there.
Yep.
All right. I think that's going to wrap this one up. Here we go with the plugs. Check out Jared over on Instagram at Backcountry Champion. He's here on YouTube at Outside Comfort Zone. You can check me out on Instagram at Dave_off_grid. And if you're listening to this podcast and not seeing it as a premiere on my channel, you can find me Dave off grid with or without the dash. That's up to you there. I also want to give a plug real quick to my buddy here, Jared, because he's going to be heading out pretty soon on the JMT. So best of luck with that, bud. I know you're going to be shooting some content for that. Anything else you're going to be posting on Instagram when you're out there? I'm just trying to give you all the social love here.
Yeah, so I'm hoping to be in touch on Instagram, but also kind of the impetus for this trip. I did the JMT in 2018. going back out there to do it again, but this time hoping to start up a series of tip videos like I made for the CT. So really kind of getting some beta and some information to help people. So in the years to come, they will be able to hike the JMT with as good information as possible. So if you're ever interested in hiking the JMT, follow along, because I'll certainly make a video of the trip or a couple of videos of the trip, but more importantly, I'm really interested in making videos that will describe things like the permitting process, or where you can start the trail, or how to get rides to and from the trail. All of that sort of more difficult to navigate information. I'm going out there to figure it all out and make a lot of mistakes along the way, so you don't have to.
Yeah, that's excellent. I know your wife, Patty, her trail name is Details, but Snackbox knows his stuff. Especially, I mean, if you've seen his stuff, you definitely know that he knows the CT like the back of his hand. But I'm excited to see your breakdown here of the JMT, and I'm really bummed that I'm not going to be able to meet you on the trail. This is, I swear to God, it's got to be like the third time this year that we've just missed each other. You're going to be in the state. Originally tried to come out for Joshua Tree. We missed him there, and then scheduling conflicts. You won't be able to make it on the Trans Catalina Trail when we're out there, and I won't be able to make it with you on the JMT. But we're still going to catch up, so that's cool. Still get a chance to see you.
Maybe we can get that J Tree trip going. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Actually, Metro was just on not too long ago, and he expressed an interest. He's like, "How far are you from there?" Definitely. So, I don't know. We'll see what comes together and what comes about with all that. But thanks for joining me, bud. Thanks everybody for hitting up the premiere. I'm sure this is going to be a premiere, so if we have the chat going for that, thank you for joining in on that. If you're catching this later, hit us up down in the comments, and we will be glad to answer any questions that you have. But thanks again, bud. I'll see everybody on the next one. So long.
Appreciate you.